Welcome to Using Augmented Reality to Teach English Literature, a case study. For the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to explore a new technology called augmented reality, or AR for short, and take a look at how it might improve teaching and learning of literature. Let's face it, English teachers are notorious for being one of the last to adapt new technologies to the classroom, and I'm no exception. But I'd like to think that's because we're already using one of the oldest, most resilient technologies ever created, the printed word. As we all know, the traditional book was first brought into widespread use by the development of the printing press in the 15th century. It's worked so well for over 500 years, we might ask ourselves why we need to change now. But let's take a fair look at what digital technologies like augmented reality bring to the classroom. And by fair, I mean we'll look at the good and the bad. We'll address some of our skepticism head-on, but we'll also look at the specific circumstances in which technology might help. Since we're talking about the teaching of literature, we're going to use the book motif for this presentation and talk about chapters rather than objectives. So here's a quick look at what you can expect. Because we have a few things to do before we get to the nuts and bolts of using augmented reality, I want to first give you a brief definition and a short example that I hope will whet your appetite for what's to come. In Chapter 2, we're going to take a step back and talk first about how technology more generally has changed the way we read. I don't think you can fairly ask an English teacher to introduce new technology to the classroom without, one, acknowledging some of the negative impacts of technology on reading, and two, given those negatives, presenting a really strong argument for how technology might enhance teaching and learning. In Chapter 3, now that our resistances are fully engaged, we're going to try to disarm them. Reading and augmented reality might have more in common than you thought, and exploring some of these commonalities, I hope, will make us a little more amenable to change. Chapter 4 is where we get to the heart of things. We're going to explore specific applications of augmented reality, using To Kill a Mockingbird as an example. Specifically, we'll talk about where and how you might incorporate AR into your teaching, and to what end or for what purpose. Once we've done that, we'll explore the nuts and bolts, the how to build and use augmented reality, using an application called Eurasma. There are many applications on the market, but this one is one of the most widely used in education. And as you'll see when we get to this point, this is a technology that doesn't require a huge investment of time to either learn or use. So let's begin. What is augmented reality? We'll start with a technical definition and try to break it down. Augmented reality is the integration of digital information with the user's environment in real time. It has a close cousin, virtual reality, which is different in an important way. Unlike virtual reality, which creates a totally artificial environment, augmented reality uses the existing environment and overlays new information on top of it. So how exactly does this work? You start by viewing what we now call the real world, as opposed to the virtual world, through a device such as a smartphone or tablet. The device then superimposes additional information onto our real-world view in the form of, for example, a video, or a three-dimensional image, or a web page. But you obviously can't point your device at just anything in your environment and expect something to appear. You have to be using a specific augmented reality application, and you have to scan a marker, or what is sometimes called a trigger image, associated with that application. A relevant example might make this a little less abstract, although this is animated, so we'll see how this works. Let's assume that you're using a new textbook in your class that has already been outfitted with augmented reality. As your students read, they encounter trigger images throughout the text. In this example, the trigger image is a light bulb. We'll say it's placed in the lower left corner of page 3. Once the student sees that image, they can use their smartphone or their tablet and an application associated with that image on their smartphone and tablet, hover their device over the image, And that, in turn, will start a new application. I mentioned either a video or three-dimensional image or another two-dimensional image. In this case, I've used an animated figure of a professor behind a podium. So we will imagine that this is a lecture being given on video about the information that was presented on page 3 of that text. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of what augmented reality is, but let's step back before we go any further and talk about what I call the elephant in the room, which is how has technology more generally changed the way we read? Let's start with what the research has taught us about how the frequent use of the internet is changing the way we read. And before I begin, I should preface this next section by acknowledging that much of this information comes from Nicholas Carr's 2011 best-selling book titled The Shadows. He condenses a lot of research in this area and writes about it in a compelling way, so if you're interested in reading more, I suggest that book or some of the source materials he cites there. So one of the things that we do know is that we tend to skim what we read online rather than reading for comprehension. We spend only a few seconds on each page, and our eyes jump around the web page sporadically rather than reading line by line the way we might look at a traditional book. According to some estimates, in fact, and these may even be generous estimates, we read only about 18% of the text on any given web page. Of course, the internet isn't about reading what's on any single page. It's also about being able to link to other information. And a little history about the hyperlink. When it first developed in the 80s and 90s, educators thought it would revolutionize learning. Specifically, they believed that giving students access to different viewpoints at the click of a mouse would enhance their critical thinking skills and help students make connections across disciplines and texts. The postmodernists of the late 20th century especially credited the hyperlink with shifting power back to the reader and undermining the notion of a single objective truth. And it's probably fair to say that the internet has in fact introduced students to multiple points of view, or at least given them the opportunity to access them should they choose to do so. But hyperlinking has come at a cost too. And what research has shown us is that navigating hyperlinks is a mentally demanding task, a problem-solving task, and that the cognitive resources required for this decision-making, for example, should I click on this link or not, and if I do, should I return to the original page or not, those kinds of decisions take away from the cognitive resources a student needs to comprehend and retain what he or she is reading in the first place. Indeed, other research shows that students who read linear text, like that in a traditional book, tend to remember more than those who read the same text that has been peppered with hyperlinks. Let's turn our attention for a second to the e-book. What distinguishes an e-book or an electronic book from a traditional one isn't only the fact that it's read on an electronic device like a Nook or a Kindle, but that it incorporates other technologies like hyperlinks, or even chat rooms, both live and asynchronous, and so forth. Some argue, in fact, that the e-book isn't a book at all, that it has more in common with the internet than traditional books. Nicholas Carr writes, as soon as you inject a book with links and connect it to the web, as soon as you extend and enhance and make it dynamic, you change what it is, and you change as well the experience of reading it. In addition to what we just discussed in the previous slide, that reading with hyperlinks is more distracted, less linear reading, the other significant change is that the e-book shifts the relationship between the author and reader. What we used to think of as the lone writer writing for the lone reader has shifted to writers writing for the group, and readers reading for a sense of belonging rather than just personal enjoyment or enlightenment. In other words, it becomes a less solitary, more social endeavor. So what does all this mean? It turns out that the differences we've been discussing aren't trivial or superficial ones. Changes in the way we read are literally changing our brains as well. When we read a traditional book, for example, and engage in what we call linear reading, left to right and each successive line down the page, we engage the parts of our brain associated with language, memory, and visual processing. On the other hand, when we read online or we read ebooks, our prefrontal cortex is active instead, the region associated with decision making. Furthermore, our brains appear to be sensitive to even small amounts of exposure to online reading, which leads to an obvious question. If even a little exposure changes the activity and connections in our brain, what does repeated, immersive, long-term exposure do? Given that the internet is in its infancy as a technology, I don't think we'll be able to answer this question, its impact on the human species over the long run, for quite some time to come. So you may be asking yourself at this point, if students retain less of what they read when it includes hyperlinks, why would I want to use augmented reality, which you could argue is itself a kind of hyperlink or a layering of additional information on top of other information? And that is a fair question, and that's why I wanted to present both sides, some of the skepticism, some of the problems that technology brings to reading, so that we could think about them as we plan how to use new technologies, especially for the teaching of literature. So as we move forward, you as a teacher will have to think critically about whether this is the right thing to bring to your classroom and whether you think the possible negatives outweigh or are okay relative to the benefits that the technology brings. So first, let's talk a little bit about what augmented reality and reading have in common. And you might be surprised by what the two have in common, and I hope it will make technology more generally a little less scary, and we might, as a result, be a little bit more open to change. First, as I mentioned in the introduction, the book is a technology itself, so we should take what is very familiar to us, what to us has always existed, and stop a moment and make it unfamiliar. The book, too, was once a new technology, and some of the concerns that arose around its widespread adoption are remarkably similar to the concerns that we have now about the internet. If we go far back in time, Socrates worried that writing would cause forgetfulness in students because they would rely less on their memory. And in the 16th century, a Swiss scientist named Gessner worried that the book itself would lead to information overload. So change isn't only inevitable, it is almost always met with resistance, and some of the same concerns, information overload, for example, pop up again and again. But the point here is that by realizing that the book itself is a technology, we might be a little bit more open to considering other technologies. Secondly, technologies don't always replace one another. They can subsist alongside each other. And so, throughout history, folks thought the book would become obsolete with the advent of the newspaper and its growing popularity at the end of the 19th century, but it survived, and it even thrived. And then the phonograph came along, and people panicked again. In 1889, Philip Hubert wrote in an essay in the Atlantic Monthly a dire prediction, that many books and stories may not see the light of print at all. They will go into their hands of their readers, or hearers rather, as phonograms. In a Harper's article around the same time, author Edward Bellamy suggested that people would read with their eyes shut because they would be hearing their stories rather than actually seeing the printed word on the page. But of course, we know that the book survived that as well. And since that time, the book has survived the introduction of the radio, television, and film. And it will likely survive the internet as well. The book also may have more in common with augmented reality, beyond the fact that they're both technologies. Indeed, in many ways, when we read, we're creating our own reality. We imagine and visualize the world described by the author in all of its detail. the sounds, the sights, the tastes, the movements of the characters. And importantly, it seems as if our brains have a difficult time distinguishing between our actually doing something and our reading about a character doing that same thing. Because the regions of the brain that are active when a character picks up an object, for example, or walks through the door, are the same regions that are active when we grasp an object or walk through a door. So in some ways, both reading a traditional book and augmented reality are ways of bringing new realities, new layers of information on top of our real-world view. Because of this, perhaps, augmented reality won't be so foreign and new a technology after all. So let's move on, dig a little deeper into the technology itself, and think about the ways that it might enhance the classroom experience. We're going to use Harper Lee's 1960 novel To Kill a Mockingbird to frame some of our discussion about using AR in the classroom. As you're probably aware, it's one of the most widely read and taught books of all time. A 1991 survey of lifetime reading habits said it was second only to the Bible among books most often cited as making a difference in people's lives. It's one of my personal favorites as well, and in this watercolor you probably recognize two of the main characters, Atticus and Scout Finch. Even if you haven't taught the book in your classroom or read it, you'll still be able to follow the discussion about augmented reality. Before we bring new technologies into the classroom, I think it's wise to stop and ask yourself a couple of questions so that you use the technology in a meaningful way and not simply because you can. It should lead, obviously, to positive outcomes for both students and teachers, and it should be integrated in a way that enhances content rather than overshadows it. So let's talk first about where or how you're going to use this technology, augmented reality, in the classroom. Some publishers are beginning to publish classic novels like Moby Dick and Great Expectations with augmented reality. So the where and the how of it may be that augmented reality is incorporated within the original text itself, much like the example that I provided, the animated example I provided earlier. So Penguin Books has partnered with Zafar Apps, which is not the application that we're going to be using for the rest of this demonstration, but they have brought several books to life, as they say, but only a handful. So since this is an emerging technology, ready-made AR texts will be few and far between, which means that most of the development work is going to fall to the teacher. But here's a short video demonstrating the new augmented reality text provided by Penguin.
Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely.
So personally, I don't know how helpful it is to see the first lines of Moby Dick written upside down or sideways, or an image of a whale spouting on screen. So this first glimpse doesn't necessarily give us an example of how AR enhances content, but nevertheless, it gives you an idea of how publishers are going to use AR to remarket some classic texts. So what I mentioned is, since these ready-made texts will be few and far between, and the ones that are available, we just saw, might not include content that's helpful, a lot of the development work is going to fall to teachers. So the second option for how and where to use AR is to create a supplement to the text, a separate handout that includes trigger images and page numbers so that students can access the supplemental information as they read. One of the advantages of this option is that you don't have to make it available to students on their first reading of the novel. which would allow them to have a more immersive, concentrated experience with the text the first time through. As they return to it to reread and study it in more depth, the augmented reality supplement would introduce them to new material. And then the final place that you might want to use AR is on a bulletin board, and this avoids the issue of interruption altogether that we talked about earlier with hyperlinks, etc. So your bulletin board may include material that you didn't have time to cover in the lecture that isn't necessarily required content for students, but allows them to explore at their leisure. Because bulletin boards have limited real estate, augmented reality gives you an opportunity to include a great deal more content than you would be able to otherwise. So here we have another animated version, another animated example of a classroom bulletin board. Imagine that the image on the right is a picture of Harper Lee that has been outfitted with a trigger image, or a marker. So when the student hovers their device over the image, it takes them to a web page that has an audio recording of one of the only interviews ever recorded with Harper Lee. So let's listen for a minute.
I think a steady worker. You know, so many writers don't like to write. I think that that's their chief complaint. They hate to write. They do it under the compulsion that makes any artist for the years, but they really don't enjoy sitting down and trying to turn a thought into a readable sentence. But I do, I like to write, and sometimes I'm afraid that I like it too much because when I get into work, I don't want to leave it. And as a result, I'll go for days and days and days without leaving a house wherever I am. I'll just go out long enough to get the papers and
It's difficult to stop listening to Harper Lee, knowing that was one of the only interviews, but let's move on for a minute. So now that we have some examples of how you might use it, the other essential question that we have to answer is why and for what end. You're probably already generating some ideas of your own, but what I think is one of the most promising functions of augmented reality is to help students make these connections across literary and historical texts. Allusions to other texts or historical events within a novel are easy to miss, and they're time-consuming to explain. In order to give students a fuller understanding of the author's intent and the meaning of the text, a supplemental handout with page numbers and trigger images would allow students to explore these connections on their own. As an example, when Lee describes in To Kill a Mockingbird the settling of Alabama and the Finch family in particular, she makes reference to General Jackson as well as the Native Americans who were once indigent population to the area where the Finches lived, but were forced out by the white settlers. The line in the book, which I believe is spoken by Scout, says, "If General Jackson hadn't run the creeks up the creek, Simon Finch would never have paddled up the Alabama. And where would we be if he hadn't?" So a trigger image within the text might take students to a brief description of the Creek War, which ended with the Creek Confederacy ceding more than 20 million acres to Jackson. Although To Kill a Mockingbird has more historical than literary allusions, there are other novels, for more advanced readers perhaps, like James Joyce's Ulysses, which makes reference to hundreds of years of English literature. And a new student to the novel wouldn't be able to make sense out of these allusions without some hand-holding, either from a teacher in a lecture traditional class format, or via augmented reality with recordings or web pages that they could access using trigger images. And then a third reason you might want to use augmented reality, especially again for more advanced students who are going off to college and thinking about potential majors, is to combine literary and film studies. A lot of classic novels have been made into movies, and departments of communication or English literature, comparative literature, often study the text against the films themselves. And so augmented reality could enhance this. If there were a trigger image on the page of the text where a particular scene takes place, and a student could watch the film scene at the same time, it would be easier to find differences in meaning or characterization, nuances in the film versus the text. So let's look at a quick example. So we'll assume here that a student is reading To Kill a Mockingbird that's been outfitted with augmented reality, or you've given them a supplemental handout with the trigger image of a video camera that will bring up the film version of that scene. In this case, our example is going to be when Scout and Jem and their neighbor friend try to save Atticus at the courthouse.
We can't see Atticus.
Well, that changes things.
Atticus.
Amber home. Big Scout and Bill home with you. Son, I said go home.
No, sir.
I'll say.
Where did he go? Where did he go?
That'll do, Scout.
Ain't nobody gonna do Jem that way.
And you don't want to leave, Mr. Page. Jem, I want you to please leave. Jem?
Then you ain't going. Where's Mr. Cunningham? I said, hey, Mr. Cunningham. How's your talent getting on? Don't you remember me, Miss Cunningham? I'm Tim Louise Finch. We brought us some hickory nuts one early morning. Remember? We had a talk.
Again, it's easy to get lost in the story of To Kill a Mockingbird, and we saw there a scene where Scout recognizes her neighbor, who's ashamed by being recognized and behaving so badly. So you're probably getting the idea by now, and I won't hit you over the head with more examples that are hard to demonstrate in a PowerPoint until we get to the application itself. So just briefly, two other ways you might use augmented reality. One, to more easily share student work across different sections of a class. So you might be teaching the same novel in your first period class and your fourth period class, and videotaping the book reports or presentations and then posting those to images on a bulletin board would help students see each other's work even if they're not in the same class period. And then finally, as I've already mentioned, just to give students access to supplemental content more easily. Something that you can prepare ahead of time that maybe isn't required course material, but that allows students to explore a little more in depth. So we're going to get to the how-tos of building and using augmented reality at this point. And I'm going to show you some images of Urasma, the app, and these are freeze frame images, but we'll go live to the application itself as well. But this is just to introduce you to how it works. And as I mentioned in the introduction, this is a very simple application. And so if you've explored YouTube at all, you'll see that there are 2-minute videos that demonstrate how to create an augmented reality image. And so it's very easy and not intimidating. So let's move forward and get started. So step one, obviously, you're going to have to create an account with Urasma. So it's free. You'll have to have a username and a password like any other software application that you use. And you'll want to likely use the application on your computer. You could also build from your phone, but it would be easier to build from your computer. So when you log in, you're going to see some already created apps that are public for viewing. So you can test a few out with your tablet or your phone if you have the application already downloaded. You could see what a few already existing augmented reality images look like. But when you create a new Aura, this is what the home page is going to look like. And it's going to ask you to click or upload the trigger image, or to select an existing trigger image. So you can import images that you would like to use as trigger images, or you can import them one by one as you're building your auras. So you're going to click Next, and then it will bring up a box like any browser box that allows you to select an image, either one already uploaded or from your computer directory. So in this case, we'll assume that we've selected a picture of Harper Lee as a young woman for our trigger image that we're going to put on a bulletin board or maybe incorporate as a handout for our text. So once you have the trigger image, you can use the photo editor, much like any photo editor, to shape the image the way you'd like it. So you can zoom in, zoom out, select part of the image, and so forth. And then the next step is going to be selecting the overlay, so the thing that shows underneath or on top of this image. So as I mentioned earlier, a video or a 3D image or a web page or just another two-dimensional image. Again, it'll ask you to select either an existing one that you've already uploaded, or it will take you to a directory on your computer where you select the thing that you want to include as your overlay. So in this case, I've selected an older picture of a picture of Harper Lee as an older woman. And so if a student goes to the bulletin board and sees a picture of Harper Lee as a young woman, they see that the image has been outfitted with augmented reality. They pull out their phone and they hover their device over the image of Harper Lee as a young woman. They will see a picture of her as an older woman just before her death a few years ago. Now you might be asking yourself why this is necessary. Why not just put the picture of Harper Lee as an older woman next to the picture of her as a younger woman? And that's a fair question, but as I mentioned, bulletin board space is limited, and so if you don't have room to put everything as an image itself on the bulletin board, this is a way to incorporate more material without having extra bulletin boards installed in your classroom. And then here is what your screen will look like when you preview the aura that you've just created. So here's our trigger image. If you take your phone out and you use the Urasma app to hover it over this image, the image of Harper Lee as an older woman will appear on your phone. So let's do this in real time now. I've logged into my account, and we're going to start from scratch, and we're going to create a new aura. So I'm going to click on the Create New Aura, and as we saw earlier, it's asking us to upload a trigger image or select an existing trigger image. I don't have any trigger images in my library right now, so we're going to upload a trigger image. We'll do a couple examples. We're going to first start with the movie poster of To Kill a Mockingbird. And so you'll see that this was just a JPEG on my PC. You can give it a title. We're just going to call it what I've already named it, Movie Poster To Kill a Mockingbird. And then you're going to save, and this is going to become our trigger image. And so we mentioned earlier, one of the ways we might want to use augmented reality is to introduce people to the film version of the text. And so what we want to do here is have this movie poster be outfitted with augmented reality, and when a student hovers his or her device over it, it pulls up a clip from the movie. So we're going to go next. Our overlay will be the film clip. And again, I have one already downloaded from the web. And so we're going to just select that movie clip, a different one than we saw earlier. And you can see it says video type. Previously it had said image. We're just going to keep that title for now, and then we're going to save. It's uploading the video. Depending obviously on the size of the file, it takes a little longer. This one's a little bit larger. Okay, and so essentially we're done. You can see that the overlay has been put in the center of our movie poster. You can shift this around. We might want to make it a little larger so that it's easier to view when you pull it up on your device. A couple of other things to note. We can add actions. So the default is that when the overlay is tapped, whatever it is, if it's a movie, the movie will begin. You can also say when the overlay is double tapped, or when it fades in or has started, or after a certain time delay. So you can change the way that the overlay comes in and is displayed. It's also possible to have multiple overlays, so each image could be outfitted with 5 or 6 if you wanted, located at different parts of the trigger image. For now we're just going to do this one, and we're going to stop here. So we're going to say next. We want to give our aura a name, so we're going to call it To Kill a Mockingbird Movie Clip. And it's currently public right now. It's being shared, so if other people looked for auras with To Kill a Mockingbird in the title, they might come across ours, and we're just going to keep it public for now. And we can go to preview, and so here in the preview frame it gives you instructions on how to test your aura. So you need your phone or your tablet. You would hover it over this image, and it would bring up the video that we just incorporated into the background. So we'll do one more example, just so that we show you how to use different file types for the overlays. So the other one that is helpful, I think, especially for a literature class, would be to incorporate a web page. So let's start here. We're going to go take our picture of Harper Lee as a young woman and use that as the trigger image. Save that. And then we're going to hit next and add our overlay. So if we wanted to include the interview that we listened to earlier, which is on YouTube, and it's just an audio, but it has this image associated with it, and it's a YouTube video. You can go here and get the YouTube address and copy it. We'll go back to our Aura app. So we're going to click Upload Overlay. We need an image associated with whatever it is we're overlaying. So if it's the video, so we need an image associated with the web page, and when the image is tapped or double tapped, it will start the web page where the address that we're giving it. So it'll make sense as we move forward. We're going to use this tree picture. We're going to make it a web page, and we're going to add the URL for the YouTube video that we just saw. And we're going to save. So as you can see, this is the tree image, which is a cover for one of the versions of the novel. This image will pop up when a student uses their device and hovers it over the picture of Harper Lee, and when it's tapped, it will take them to the website where the audio recording of the interview is. We're going to name it Harper Lee Interview and save. And that's really all there is. I can't easily show you the hovering of the device over the image when I'm recording my laptop, and so you will have to practice that part on your own. But as you can see, this is just a two-step process. You can print the images then, put them on your bulletin board, incorporate them into a handout, and you're ready to go. So hopefully this has been a helpful introduction to augmented reality. And really my main objective, as a teacher, you have to critically evaluate teaching methods and technologies all the time to determine if they lead to better outcomes for your students. And what I've tried to do is give you enough information to assess whether augmented reality is a technology that will bring value to your classroom. And if it is, great, and if not, that's okay too. One of the negative impacts of technology on reading that we discussed earlier is just the constant interruption or disruption created by the hyperlink. And I expressed some concern that augmented reality was similar to a hyperlink, but hopefully I've shown you a few ways that you can incorporate it into the classroom so that it's not necessarily an interruption and that it's rather an enhancement to the content that you're teaching, and gives students tools to make better, deeper connections to other texts, to film, to historical content, texts, etc. So that concludes our presentation of using augmented reality to teach English literature. And I wish you all a good day, and as Atticus Finch might say, his famous quote, I hope that you are able to climb into someone else's skin and walk around in their shoes for a while. Thanks so much for listening. Bye.